Today we're going to be talking about how you can use palette knives, aka painting knives, to really up your game in painting. So I want to give everybody just a little quick chance to hop on. So housekeeping first. If you haven't joined us live before, remember you want to turn off all other streaming devices because anything else you've got turned on can suck your bandwidth. And we're going to be taking up some bandwidth today because I'm going to be showing you some videos. So make sure you've got all those other things turned off. Second piece of housekeeping, chat roll is down here at the bottom if you're on desktop. It could be on the side, above, or below if you're on mobile. Go ahead and open that chat roll now. That's where you're going to be able to ask questions and see the other comments from the group. First thing you need to change on there is down at the bottom, you'll see a button that says All Panelists by default when the chat roll opens. Switch that little sucker to All Panelists and Attendees. So make sure that button says All Panelists and Attendees so that you can see all of the comments and questions as they come in. Super important. Do that now. Open the chat roll. That's the idea bubble with the 3 dots in it. Then switch that button to All Panelists and Attendees so you can see all the comments from everybody. And I see people are doing that already. Awesome sauce. Thank you, Rachel and Virginia. Glad to have y'all here and glad you've already got that popped open. So the 3 parts of talking about a palette knife, working with painting knives, that I want to really make sure I cover today are the basics. I want to talk about first choosing the right knife and what the wrong one is, and then second, how to use the painting knife most effectively. And I've got some knives loaded up with paint right here, right now, so I'm going to show you live how to hold that knife, how much paint to put on it, and how to use it most effectively. Then I'm going to show you a demo of my painting, a small painting with the palette knives, those same knives. Third thing, final thing, because you may not want to use just the painting knives, how to integrate using a knife and a brush in the same painting. So if you've got a question, or if a question comes up while we're going through the training, go ahead and type it in the chat roll, and I'll be sure to come back to it before we log off. And if it's a question that fits right in with what we're doing, I'll stop right then and answer it. Otherwise, I'm going to catch all the questions on the other side at the end. So first thing I want to talk about is which knife, what knives, which knives should you choose? Because there are a whole lot of them out there. And I want to take us over to a quick screenshot of, let's see if I can make sure my window's coming up. For some reason, it just disappeared. Let's see. I just lost half of my, there it is, half of my images. It was just hiding. So let me try that one more time here and make sure it goes correctly. So the knife that a lot of people think about, here we go. The first knife that comes to mind when you say palette knife or painting knife is the knife that people are used to using to mix their paint. That knife is the wrong knife to use. That knife is the one that's designed to mix paint with. It's not the best knife to paint with. And that's the first mistake a lot of people make, is that they start trying to paint with a knife that wasn't designed for painting. It was designed for mixing. And I'm going to be flat out honest, I don't use it for mixing either because I don't think it's well designed for that either. So don't use a, quote, palette knife to paint with. First key to success. The knives you see up there right now, those are not the right knives. Instead, let me show you what will work a whole lot better. And these are knives that are designed just for painting. There are a bunch of different brands that you can use. I use RGM And RGM is an Italian company that makes painting knives. And they also make the painting knives under the Blick label. So if you buy painting knives online from dickblick.com, they usually, almost always, are made by that same favorite company of mine, by RGM. So for example, this one right here is one that was made by RGM for Blick, so it carries both labels. If it just has Blick on there, it's still probably R&M. It's still probably the Italian company. They make excellent painting knives that are kind of in the mid-range. They're not cheap, but they're not so expensive that they feel prohibitive to use. They run about $7 or $8 a painting knife, and they will last forever. To show you just how long they'll last, this was my first painting knife. A student gave it to me more than 10 years ago, and it was what really introduced me to painting with a knife. So this one has taken a lot of abuse. You can't even read the label on it anymore. And I never have cleaned it like I clean all my others. It looks pretty disreputable, but it still works. Palette knives, painting knives will last forever if you take half-decent care of them. They wear down on the tips a little bit, just like a good writing pen will. It conforms to your hand. Doesn't mean you need to get rid of it. It means that you shouldn't be sharing it with anybody else because it's now conforming to the way you hold it in your hand. So this is one that I use all the time. It is a number 81 on the RGM Dick Blick number chart. So it's a number 81. I use this one primarily to mix paint. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute. People have asked me, how do you keep your paint piles so neat and so tidy? This is the answer. I also use this to paint with as well, but it gets most of its heavy duty work from mixing my paint. The next one that I use an awful lot, in fact, it is my main painting knife, is this one right here. And this is a 109, number 109. And the number 109 has multiple edges that you can use to carry the paint. There's a 106 that's really similar that has an extra edge as well. Now, who notices something else about this knife that's different from this one? Anybody see any differences? Type it into the chat roll if you see it. Yeah, okay, they absolutely conform to the owner's hand. Don't ever lend your knives out. So anybody see a difference between the bottom one, the number 81, and the 109 besides the shape of the blade? Anything else? Type it into the chat roll if you see a difference. And this is not a trick question. It's a really obvious difference. What's the most obvious difference you see between these two knives? I want to see if anybody gets it. Big, big difference. Hint, hint. Color, hint, hint. Anybody see the difference? Oh, come on, y'all. I know you see the difference. Yes, Rachel, it's wider, besides the shape of the knife. Thank you, Jane. Yes, Jane said blade color. So look at the two blades. This one is non-reflective. It has a black anodized surface. It's also made by RGM, and it's made exclusively for Dick Blick. It's the blue-handled painting knife. And they have a whole entire line. I'll hold the ones up that I usually use. Oops, these are the ones I've got loaded with paint. So here are two others. This is the 106 and the number 81. So let me put those carefully down so I don't get paint all over the studio. So the reason that it's non-reflective, and it has a blue handle, but the main reason it's non-reflective is so that you can paint it with it plein air. Because let me tell you, painting with something like this plein air hurts. This surface is so reflective that if you're in a sunny climate at all, it's going to catch the light of the sun. It's going to bounce off of it right into your eyes. And it physically hurts when you're painting over a long period of time. So if you're going to paint with them plein air, get the black anodized blade made by RGM for Dick Blick. They call them the blue handle knives. The only difference between this and the regular RGM knife is that that's an anodized blade. It's black and it's slightly more flexible, just a tiny little bit, but not enough that it's really going to be disturbing. After a while, that blade is going to wear down. So I'm going to zoom in here so y'all can see how much I've worn it down. See where the black is wearing off? And see which side I use more often and where more of the pressure goes. So this knife really needs to be replaced. And it's getting to the point with both of the big knives that when I'm outside painting, the edges of them catch the light and blind me. So after a while, they become studio knives. Doesn't mean you need to throw them away. It means they need to get retired to the studio and not used in the bright sunlight. So you can get all the marks that you want to make with pretty much 2 to 3 knives. I use the number 81 and the 109 all the time. Every time I go out into the out plein air to paint, those two go with me. Others go sometimes too. And I'll play around with buying other knives and experimenting in the studio. But this is my go-to knife. I can actually paint an entire painting with just the big old 109. What it does for you is that it gives you a big broad mark so that you can't get too finicky. It's the same reason I advocate using a big brush when you're laying in that first layer of paint. When you use a big brush or a big knife, you can't get caught up in the details, and it helps you to lay in or block in the first pass on a painting really, 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 really quickly. So that's one of the big advantages of it. You can see how different this is from that mixing knife, the palette knife that so many people attempt to paint with. Really, really, really different. So again, I mainly use that tip. It's got a black surface that protects your eyeballs when you're out painting outside and just makes it all around a whole lot easier to use. Highly recommend the blue handled blades. Now, as you go larger in paintings, so those are the ones that I'm doing the smaller daily paintings with, and I'll paint with that big knife all the way up to say a 24 by 24, but it becomes my small knife on a bigger painting. When I go large, when I go any larger than about a 2 by 2 foot painting, the big knives come out. That's these and some others as well. But can you see how similar in shape this is to the 109? It's the same basic shape, just a whole heck of a lot larger. So as you go up in scale, you need to go up in size of the tool so that you get the same kind of free large marks. So it's very, very important to use the right tool. I'm going to show you some of my early palette knife paintings, and you can see where I made some mistakes both with the tool and with how much paint I was putting on there. So the knife you choose makes an enormous difference. And again, the numbers that I recommend are the RGM, aka Dick Blick, painting knives, number 81 and number 109. Those are the easiest to get started with. And you can experiment with others, but those are hands down the best ones to get going with in the very beginning. So I want to show you some of the early paintings that I did with a palette knife. I played with that first little palette knife that I showed you for quite a while after my student gave it to me, but I only used it to embellish large paintings or paintings that I did mainly with the brush. So it was what I used at the end to add thicker paint to it. But at the beginning, when I really first started using it all the time, I had a lot of trouble with it. And this is the result of not knowing how much paint to put on the knife and not knowing how thickly to apply the paint as you're painting. One thing I did get right when I started doing these was choosing the correct surface too. So if you're going to paint with a palette knife, it works a whole lot better on a resistant surface. I'll show you one of those in a minute. So don't try it on canvas that's stretched. It's too flexible. It'll give too much. So these are all on panel. And I did these, it's my first daily painting project from back in, I think 2011, may have been 2010. But these are all 4 by 6 inches, and I did one a day. I was painting them at night in about an hour and a half. And these are literally the very first ones that I did with that number 81. That's the only knife I had at that point. And to begin with, they were pretty gloopy and inconsistent. So this is the very first one here. This is the second one. Second one went a whole lot better than the first one. Go back to the first one. Can y'all see those clunked up areas of paint where I've piled on the paint on the knife and put it down and it just wasn't under control? Well, in the second one, I got a little bit more control, and then I got cocky. I kind of liked the second one. So in the third one, I thought, this is going to be easy. I'll pick a more difficult subject. Moss draped and kudzu draped trees in the swamp as I was going over a bridge, going through one of the swampy areas. That didn't work out so well. So this one suffers from Gloopy Syndrome again. Can y'all see that thick paint where it's glooping up? It's not giving you the pleasing texture that most of us are trying to get with palette knife. Instead, it's just piling up in kind of an almost uncontrolled, it was an uncontrolled way. So back to the drawing board I went. Next one still felt pretty gloopy. This is number 4, day 4. Remember, at this point, I've been painting 30 years, so Hotshot Mary thought she knew it all, and this should be easy, but it wasn't. So I want you to remember, if you decide to experiment with palette knife, it is not going to be perfect from the very first painting. I'd been painting 30 years. Those first paintings are far from perfect. It took pretty much that whole first project for me to get comfortable with it. And I did that, a daily painting every day for 3 months. That was number 4. By number 5, I actually was beginning to get the hang of it. And the gloopy paintings didn't happen quite as often. So instead of it being every other painting, it became more like every 5th or 6th painting. So I want you to remember to cut yourself some slack and don't expect practically perfect paintings from the very first moment. So the way that you load the knife becomes really important, just like the way you load a paintbrush with paint is really important. So the way you load it and how you hold it, how much paint you put on at one time, super crucial. So let's look at that, because I have some loaded up here and prepped, ready to show you. Virginia says, where do you get the larger knives and what are their numbers? Virginia, you can get them from Dick Blick. That's where I got them from. We have a Dick Blick store here in Savannah. So I treat myself and go in there and grab them after I finish different projects. So the numbers are not on here. So I'll have to, actually maybe they are on the back. I'm gonna have to double check on those for those big knives for you. And I'll put those into a handout with the suggested paint knives for you. So first of all, I want you to look at these 2 knives. This is the back. I've loaded these up already with paint. You can see my palette box open over there. Now, what I had done when I first started was to put paint on so that it came down almost 1/2 inch. It was piled on because I'm going, This is going to be faster if I put more paint on at one time. It's not how it works. So you want to load it with about, that's probably about 1/8 of an inch, fairly thin. Let's see if I can hold it up here where you can see. Y'all see how thin that is? It's not a whole lot of paint at all. You're better off making more strokes and wiping in between than piling the paint on at one time. And it's about the same on this one. Very small amount of paint. Very, very tiny amount of paint. So if I was, you really use either knife the same way. So here I have just a little test panel on a foam core board. This is the way that I paint on small paintings. There's Scotch tape loops on the back of the panel, and that sticks it to the foam core board so I can paint all the way to the edges. I have an OCD thing about I need to be able to hit all of the edges. I can't stand it when I can't reach them. So if the clamp or whatever's holding it to the easel blocks it, it makes me a little nuts. It also lets me work on the whole painting at one time and turn it if I need to. So I'm going to hold it like this, and I want you to see that when I'm painting on here, I'm holding the knife almost parallel to the surface of the panel, and I'm laying it down and making a stroke. Going the other direction if I need to, and make a stroke. Let some of the texture that naturally happens begin to shape that mark. Same thing with the bigger knife. Hold it practically parallel, get it in the middle here, practically parallel to the surface. You see how parallel it is? And do not bear down. Where people make a big mistake is they bear down like this and they pull it, and it pulls up all the paint that was underneath there. So in order for it to really work, you want to be light, like you're icing a cake. So apply the paint like you're icing a vanilla or yellow cake with chocolate icing. And you don't want yellow cake crumbs showing up in your chocolate icing. So you hold it almost parallel and you let it glide across the surface. Don't bear down unless you want to pull the paint up. You work from thin to thick, background to foreground. We're going to look at that in just a second because I want to show you both how to mix with the number 81 and a really quick overview of how to apply the paint and go from thin to thick and build those layers up. Now, what I mean by thin to thick is the very first layers that you lay down on a painting need to be so thin that you can see the panel underneath. When you do that, you're applying it thinly enough that you can put a thicker layer on top of that and it's not going to pull the paint off underneath. Make sense? So there are two main things to remember here. One, when you're mixing, I want you to use the number 81, and you're going to watch me in just a second doing it. You do something I call plow and turn. So Virginia, you've seen me do this in person at workshops. You want to plow and turn, which means you take the number 81, you put the paint down on your palette, you plow, which means you hold it like this, plow it and turn it. Plow it and turn it to mix. That way you mix it evenly and you don't end up with a paint pile that's 4 by 4 feet. So let's look first here at how to mix the paint. So let me pull that up, and I have, get to the right screen here. Then I'll let you see that, and I'm going to talk over the video just a little bit so that you can see the action here. So this is a demo for one of my online courses, and it's in a module that I don't include in that course anymore. But I am mixing the colors that are going to be used in that painting for that demo. And you remember that I advocate mixing your colors ahead of time. Now I want y'all to look at how I am holding that knife and how I'm using it to contain the paint in a very small area. And look how little paint I'm putting on there as I mix. Mix slowly and mix thoroughly, and you can control where the paint is going on your palette. So I'm doing a lot of plowing. There I plow, pushing it back into a pile, and then turn. Plow, turn. Can y'all see how that works? You're plowing and turning until you get the paint into a thoroughly mixed state. And I'm doing the same thing here as I go to the next color up at the top. You see how I'm plowing and turning and wiping frequently in between so that I'm keeping my paint mixtures clean. So the piles that I'm mixing there are about the right amount for a 4x6 or a 5x7 inch painting. So it ends up being a pile that is about the size of a quarter coin, for those of you who are in the States. 50 pence piece if you're in the UK. So it's a small amount of paint, but not as tiny as most of my students tend to start with. Most people mix too little paint to begin with, or they mix an enormous paint pile that covers a 4x4 foot area. You don't want to do either of those extremes. Go for the middle. Remember, plow and turn. When you plow and turn, you can contain the paint. So if it starts to spread out, plow it back towards the center and then turn it so that it stays in one of those piles. So the next thing I wanted to show you is a little quick demo of how you use that in creating a painting. So in using the bigger knife to do the first layers, and this is an alla prima painting approach, so it's all in one layer. Alla prima means all in one layer. It's wet in wet. So wet in wet painting. When you're painting wet and wet, whether you're using a knife or a brush, you want to go from thin to thick, background to foreground, dark to light. This includes watercolor. I know it's counterintuitive for a lot of people. This is true for watercolor as well. So, but in general, alla prima, wet and wet, background to foreground, big shapes to small shapes, dark to light, thin to thick. So let's get this one going, and you'll see how I did that in this painting. Whoops, let me turn off the sound there. So this is the final painting, and you're going to see me get started with it. Photo reference right here. And then diving in to blocking that painting in. So let me see if I can scoot it ahead here. It's spending too long. Let's see if I get it to the right spot. For some reason, it's stuck. There we go. So these are the colors that I was using for that painting. And you're going to see me blocking that in with the big knife. So I'm in the studio and I can use the more reflective knives. See where I'm using my finger on the big knife to control that blade, and how almost parallel to the surface of the panel I'm holding it. And I'm blocking in the darkest darks, the big shapes, the no-tan. Those of you who've heard me talk about no-tan before. I'm blocking that part in, and I'm holding the panel upside down. So what you're seeing is the bottom of the painting is at the top of the panel, and the top of the painting was at the bottom of the panel there. Now it's turned around the other way. Can y'all see how thin that is? That you can actually see the gold underpainting on the panel through that first layer of paint. Crucial that you keep it that thin. Another important part of working with a knife is the consistency of the paint. So do not add medium to the paint when you're working with a palette knife. When you're working a la prima, it'll make the paint too runny. The paint actually needs to be pretty stiff. If you're working in acrylics, then you need to add something like molding paste to it to give it a little bit more stiffness and make it a little easier to handle. But can y'all see how thin that paint is? You can see the actual surface of the panel through the paint. That's how thin it needs to be. If you get it on too thickly, then you can pull the extra off so that it's not so darn thick. So you can also wipe back if you need to where it gets too thick when you're working on a panel. That's much harder to do when you're on a canvas. So I'm going to zoom ahead here a little bit, speeding up there so that you can see those first layers going in. So here I am blocking in the sky there. Remember I said big shapes first. So I blocked in the darks on the land and then the big shapes on the sky. And that big knife means you can put a lot of paint, cover a lot of ground. It's not that much paint that's on the knife, but you're covering a great deal of ground all at one time, working super quickly, and you can blend and block all at the same point. Then once you have those first layers on, I'm going to zoom in here, you can go in and fill in the detail areas of the other shapes and begin laying in the second pass. So there we get our details in. And at this stage, it's the next pass that's going in. So you begin breaking up those big shapes into slightly smaller shapes. The key with either a knife or a brush when you're working a la prima is to wipe those off as you finish with one color and go to the next. Where people make a hot mess working a la prima is they take a dirty brush or a dirty knife and dip it into the next color. And it doesn't mean you have to clean your brush off or your knife. Simply wiping it with a paper towel is enough. Now, can you see how much more paint there is in this second pass? There's more paint on the knife. And because I'm working thin to thick, that thicker paint will pop right on top of the thinner paint without blending too much. Because thick can go on top of thin. So I laid that second layer on, letting a little bit of the dark show through really, really, really quickly. And then working just as fast, putting in the third layer on top of that. Beginning to develop the forms in that painting. Let you see the rest of the finish here. So the lightest colors are going on last. The things that are in front go on last. Can you see how, again, parallel to the surface of the painting, I'm holding that knife. Not perpendicular, but parallel. If you hold it perpendicular, it's going to scoot paint off. There are times definitely when you want to do that. But if you're not careful, you'll pull the paint off. Holding it parallel lets you lay paint down instead. So then you can work back and forth, layering the various colors onto the panel. And you can see already there's a great deal of space that's been developed in a pretty short period of time. And the last part of what I was working on in that painting is just finessing those last final shapes, the last final colors. So here I'm laying in the lightest light on that background or backlit line of trees. The foreground trees are in silhouette, but that back line of trees is catching the light, direct, strong sunlight. So I'm building up what I counted was the 4th layer of paint on top of those trees and beginning to really break up that line where the light is hitting. And I only spent about 4 more minutes on that in adding in some quick clouds into the sky and finessing that bottom part of the painting before it was pretty much done. Give you the final minute there so you can see the final painting. So that is the finished painting. And it took all of about 22 minutes from beginning the block in till the painting was finished. Partially because I had the paint already mixed with number 81, and because I was using the palette knife to build it wet and wet. It meant I could work so much faster. Now, the way that you would integrate this with a brush, especially if you're working on canvas. So those of you who want to kind of sneak sideways into working with a palette knife, what you're going to want to do is begin to do what I did. You know, take that number 81 or the 109. You know, this is the 81, the smaller one. Use it to add the slightly thicker paint, the more textured marks at the end of your painting. And that will let you work into slowly adding it into your repertoire of mark making and surface skills without feeling overwhelming. The other thing that you can do is do some of those 20-minute paintings that we've done in the challenge before in order to build up your comfort level and your skill level with handling the knife. But I think starting with a brush and knife and adding the knife as the final step is one way to really begin adding it in without feeling so overwhelmed. You don't have to start out making those gloopy paintings that I showed you earlier. You can make paintings where it feels like they're an effortless addition to what you're doing. So I wanted to make sure I left plenty of time for questions here. So I'm going to dive into the chat roll. And if you've been holding back on your questions, go on and type them in there. And let me know what questions you've got. I'm glad it's really helpful there, Kate. Awesome. Let me go back to the beginning here. So Kate said, I didn't know that about the knife conforming to its owner's hand. And it really does, Kate. If I pull up that first one that I had, which I seem to have stuck. Oh, there it is. So this one I've had for, like I said, more than 10 years. And I'm going to zoom in on these so that you can see, put it in front of the canvas, so y'all can see the tips. And you can see, let's see if I can get that one a little bit closer. You can see how much the one on the left, actually they both are, worn down, because I would hold them and put more pressure on one side than the other. So on this one, for example, it is worn down more on this side than this side. Because I'm predominantly right-handed, the right side takes the mark first. And if somebody else holds that and they're left-handed and they put it like this, it's not going to make the same kind of mark. Or if I switch hands, which I do sometimes. So the way that you hold it begins to shape the knife. It's also, let me hold it up here again where you can see it, slightly curved up there. So it's got an angle now and it's slightly curved. So that definitely will take on the mark or the shape of the way that you hold it. So you don't need to get rid of them once that starts to happen, but it means you shouldn't be sharing them out. Nobody else gets to touch this. I hide it away, but they definitely take on that different shape. I'm going to pull up the Dick Blick site, Virginia, and show you where those are. And let me see here if I can get that really quickly, because that is the easiest place to order them from. City Art online can order them for you as well, but Blick keeps them in stock. They're just a little obscure in the way that they are laid out in that catalog, which is one reason I wanted to pull it up, because it's not clear at first what you're looking for. So the blue comfort grip, these are the ones that I was recommending if you paint plein air. The RGM, the regular ones are, I believe the Ideal line is what they're calling them now, because they keep switching around the names. Blick palette knives are by RGM, also recommend those. Now when you go for the big, large ones, you're going for the large painting spatulas. And they do cost more, but they're awesome. So any of these, let's look at them a little enlarged, are really, really good. The ones that I bought to begin with are this one, and this one, and I think this one, because I was getting ones that are really similar to what I already used. So this one is similar to the 81. This one is similar to the 109. As is this one, it's just a little different shape. And this one was just a really nice, big, wide blade to work with. So I use these on big, big, giant paintings. And so if you go to the Dick Blick site and go to the RGM large spatulas, you'll see these ones that I have pointed out here. So it'll show also in the replay, so you can pull those up. But I'll try to include the numbers as well. So it was the 8004, 8005, 8007. Actually have the 11 and the 12 as well. So that's the 80 number, then plus the other number on the end of it. Get back here. The regular ones are the Comfort Grip, and these are the ones that have the black anodized blade, so it's not going to be so darn reflective when you're outside. I wouldn't buy the sets because you're going to get some that you might not use as much to get started with, and boy does it increase the cost when you're getting started. Instead, go for the style numbers that I talked about earlier, and that would be the number 81 right here, the number 109 right here. The other one that I really like a lot is the number 61. And it's this little thin one right here. That's a great addition, but not necessary. You can get by with just those other two to begin with. But that black surface is really nice when you're painting outside. So, awesome. Virginia says, what was the palette you were using in the demo? Was it glass? Never. I do not use a glass palette, period, ever. As most of y'all know, I taught at the college level for over 20 years. And when you're working in a studio with 20 or 30 sophomores in a painting class, and you have glass palettes perched precariously on tabourets, because that's just what teenagers do, you know, accidents happen. And I have a tendency to be the one who cuts myself on broken glass. So We had some catastrophic glass accidents where the entire pallet dropped onto the concrete floor and shattered, and either scattered the oil medium across the studio so that it was a slick hazard. I'll tell you how fun that was to clean up. Or people cut themselves on the glass. And that was at least one time me. So I didn't allow it in the classroom, and I still don't use it for that reason. It's dangerous. Second reason is it's heavy as lead. And I'm all about having lightweight materials and supplies. I use plexiglass. So the plexiglass, it has the tan sticky paper on the back still on one side. And those are scraps that came from my studio from framing. But you can get the same thing at any glass or plastic shop that cuts the glass and plastic. You can go to the scrap pile if you want to pay a little bit less, or you can ask them to specifically cut one to the size of the box that you use. I've done that too. And ask them to leave the paper on. So that sticky paper comes on the plexi when you buy it, and it's to keep it from getting scratched while it's in storage. And then I pull the paper off of just one side, and it leaves the neutral color on the other. And since I tone most of my panels with yellow ochre, that golden color, having that tan color behind is perfect for mixing colors, because you want to mix your paint on a palette that has the same color behind it as the canvas that you're going to work on. Otherwise, your color gets distorted. So I use plexi. I do not recommend glass. I think it's incredibly dangerous. I've seen too many people with glass that had no sanding down on the edges, so that you have this sharp glass sticking out in the studio, and it gives me the willies. Don't do that. Everybody go get plexiglass. People worry about cleaning it and scratching it. Well, what's the big disaster if you do scratch it? Newsflash, there is none. I use the exact same tool that most people use to clean the glass. I have a glass scraper, a paint scraper, and it's that razor blade that's retractable. And I scrape the paint off when I need to and scrape it back down to the basic surface. You can also clean off any remnants with something called citrus salt, which is a natural organic cleaner that you can use in the house. It's not got the nasty solvents in it. So you can clean it just as easily as glass, and it's just so much safer and lighter. Sigrid says, isn't it difficult to make curves and round shapes with a knife? Nope, not any more difficult than with a brush. The difference is mainly just that how much you're used to using it. So you can still make very curved marks with a knife. Let me show you some that I did. This will show you right now. So let me share the screen here again. These are some that I did this past month, and people thought I did them with a brush. So in looking at this one, this streak, it was a contrail, I'm sure, that was in the sky. That streak of light, that cloud, that was the knife. I didn't use a brush to do that. So it's a matter of holding the knife correctly to make that curved mark and not overthinking it. Then another one, if I can get this to go back fast enough. The last ones, scroll past all the baby pictures. One of the last ones that I did, I don't think it's on here. There it is. Nope, that's not it. Here it is. So on this one, people thought this was one that I did with a brush, and it's not. It was that first initial block in with a knife on a linen panel. So it's still the knife. This mark here is all still the knife. These marks down here that show the looping line of the water in the marsh, that's the knife. So it's just a matter of getting used to it. It probably will be harder at first because you're not used to holding it, but you can practice. Just get some oil painting paper and Arches oil paper and just practice making loops, practice making curves and circles, and it becomes so much easier. But no, I don't find it any more difficult after a certain amount of time to make those kind of marks at all. So, any other final questions? We've got about 3 minutes left before we have to hop off. One of the things that I'm going to be posting along with the replay of the training is I will be posting a sheet with the knife numbers that I've talked about today and the other materials that I've talked about as well, so that you can dive in and test out using a palette knife. And I'm going to give y'all some motivation to do it. So next month in March, we have the public daily painting challenge coming up. And it is so much easier to do daily paintings, to do those 20-minute paintings if you're using a knife. So get a head start on that. Get a little comfy with it now and get some materials like Arches oil paper that's really inexpensive to work with, or just some plain drawing paper that you gessoed, like Stonehenge on the heavier drawing paper. Gesso it with about 3 coats of gesso and you can paint on top of it and have fun with it. Virginia says, now I'm going to repaint yesterday's goopy painting. Haha. The other thing you can do with it, Virginia, I doubt it's as goopy as you're saying, is that you can scrape back with a knife and get interesting textures and surfaces that way. So one of the ways that things that I frequently do is to pull paint off as well as putting paint on. And the knife makes that 100% faster to do. You can move paint off with a brush, but it's so much easier with a knife. So you can control the thickness and the thinness of it a whole lot more easily. Happy painting, everybody. Bye-bye for now.